And they talk about how like nice it must be, like you have no responsibilities, right? Like you ever heard that before? Like, man, it's so much easier for you, man. You don't have to pay bills. You don't know what it's like to like pay rent. You pay for maybe a little bit of your food, maybe a little bit of your gas, but like you don't have like all these massive responsibilities. You guys heard that a lot? And I think like some of that's probably true, right? Like there's some of it that can be pretty awesome to be young. Like you don't have to worry about making a living and you really don't have many bills, and you do get to kind of figure out who you want to be. And you get the summer off, which is like the best part, right? Like 5 weeks, you guys get the summer off. Like, dude, I wish I still got the summer off. Like, there's some things about being young that are really cool, but you also know that there's some disadvantages, right? And you've heard them, and you know them, right? Like you guys have to actually go to school and sit there for 8 hours and listen to people talk. Like, do you ever think about that? You're like, dude, I'm so glad I don't ever have to do that again. Like, but you guys have to do that, right? And if you don't pay attention, you're going to get in trouble. And if you don't take enough notes, you're going to get in trouble. And if you don't do good enough on the test of what they just talked about forever, you're going to get in trouble. So you have to like pay attention for this whole time. Like, that's not easy, right? Like, you have to ask permission to go to the bathroom. I don't have to ask permission to go to the bathroom. You have to like ask permission to go to the bathroom. Your world is like essentially built around someone else's rules, right? Like you have parents that tell you like when to get home. Sometimes they tell you like what you need to eat, when you go to bed. When you go to school, you have you walk into a world that's built around rules. You have to like live within those rules. You're going to get in trouble, you're going to get expelled, and then you're going to like also get in trouble at home, right? Like, it's not always the easiest thing to be young. And I'll give you a few. I think these are like kind of the things that I think I realize the most. Like, do you ever get the feeling like no one is listening to you? Right? Like, that's fair. You ever get the feeling that like what you say doesn't matter? You ever get the feeling that older people tend to look down on you? Like, these are like some real feelings, like if you're young, right? Like maybe this is like part of like the worst experience of being young is you feel like you're not really respected, you're not really heard, and your opinion doesn't really matter until you reach like a certain age, and then maybe you'll be taken seriously. But as of right now, there's not a whole lot of hearing you. There's not like a whole lot of respect for you, and you're not like seen as all that helpful. Do you guys ever feel like that? Do you think that's right? Like, for real, like, is there something like inside of you where like, man, I feel like something's wrong with that? Like, does it make sense that I live in a world that my thoughts don't matter, that like what I feel doesn't necessarily matter, and like my opinions of the world don't necessarily matter because I'm not old enough yet? I want to read something for you. Actually, this isn't even in my notes, but I was just thinking of it. If you have your Bibles, turn to Acts 2. You guys can Google it back there if you want. I don't even have notes for it. Acts 2, 17. And it says this. I think this is something cool because I think we live in a world where like you guys as like young people, I don't think you're always told like what you're capable of. Like, I don't think you always hear like this is like really what God has for you. So it says this in Acts 2. Verse 17, it says, in the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. So God says, look, I'm going to take what is me, like the essence of me, what is like burning down in your soul, the satisfaction, this great essence that is the deity of God. I'm going to pour it out on all people. And then it says this, and your sons and your daughters. What is that? That's young people. Right? And your young people shall prophesy. Do you know what it means to prophesy? It means that you are speaking something that you don't yet see. It means that you are talking about stuff that does not yet exist yet. It says you will prophesy. And it says your young men and your young women will see visions. This is what God says, that there's going to be this moment where he is going to look at the younger generation and he's going to put something in you that the older generation doesn't see. He's going to like show you guys things. You guys are going to see things before they even happen. And this is what I mean by that. Like when we prophesy, it means that we speak with our mouth and we believe it's going to happen, whether we see it or not, right? It's faith through speaking. And it says you are going to have like this ability to speak things over your generation. And I think this is like one of the most powerful things you can really get a hold of as like a young person. Like you have the ability to speak over your generation and say, we will not be a generation that sees nothing but divorce. We will not be a generation that sees nothing but depression. We will not be a suicide generation. This will not be us. But I think here's the problem, and I think this is what we run into when we're young, is I don't think we're ever told that we carry that. I don't think we ever believe that we have that gift, and yet it is still in us, and so we prophesy something different. And we say, man, I am like worthless. Like I'm not good enough. I'm not good at school. I'm not good at making friends. I'm not really like worth a whole lot. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not good looking enough. Like it is not enough. Like I am not enough. And you know what happens is you speak that over you, and that's what you become. You like prophesy over yourself. And I think like we see that in our generation. I think this is why like we walk and like, you guys have probably heard this. I think this is why we walk in the midst of like the most offended generation of all time. It's because we speak it over ourselves. Like we constantly say, man, that hurts me, that offends me. You can't say that. Like you can't have different beliefs than me. You can't look different than me. You can't feel different than me. Like we all have to be in unison together. And if we're not, man, everything falls apart and like it hurts and it's depression. And we speak those things and we constantly like bring ourselves down to the point that now we are a generation that everything has hurt us. Do you realize like that is not what God called us to be? God has called us to like be warriors. God has called us to be an army, and yet somehow we have become this generation that cowers at everything. But I think like you guys in this room, like you guys have something powerful because you can begin to realize that that is not your calling. You can begin to realize that God has something so much more for you. I want to read this. It's in 1 Timothy 4:12. We do have it on the screen. And this is like what God says about your age. And I think this is like one of those things, man, you like memorize this verse, put it inside your soul, put it inside your spirit, and realize this is what God says about you. So this is Paul and Timothy. Paul is saying this to Timothy. Paul is a mentor to Timothy. How many of you guys have heard of Paul? Everybody. How many of you guys have heard of Timothy? Not as many, right? Like Paul was a stud of his day, right? He's like the evangelical missional like standard. Like nobody is ever going to beat Paul for what he did. He wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, almost every continent he touched at some point and brought Jesus there. And this is what he says to the younger Timothy. He says, don't ever let anybody look down on you because you are young. Now think about this. When the church leaders thought of Timothy or Paul, who was the one that they probably really cared about? Paul, right? He's the stud. He's the one that like is really like doing amazing things for God. Timothy's just like his young protege. He's just the young guy. He's the sidekick. And yet Paul looks at Timothy and says, don't let anybody ever look down on you because you are young. But this is the generation that we live in, right? We're always looked down upon because we're younger. I say that like kind of removed now. I'm not as young as you guys anymore. But like that's truth for you guys, right? Like it's looked down upon because of your age. And he says, but don't let that happen. We are called to do something different. We are not called to be looked down upon because of our age. In fact, Paul even says like, don't allow them to. And I want you to think about this, like, so how do you change that? Right? Like, because that's like the obvious question of like, okay, Wes, that's cool. Like, okay, Paul, like, that's cool. That's like that's a good speech, right? Like, man, you shouldn't look down on me because I'm young. Like, that's great. But like, how do I change that? Because that's really kind of like where the rubber meets the road, right? Like, how as a young people do I begin to change what that looks like? And it continues. If we want to throw that verse up there, 1 Timothy 4:12, this is how the rest of that verse continues. It says, don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. Now, see, this is something that, like, I think most people will not tell you, but do you understand, like, you can set an example for me. You can set an example for Seth and Jordan and Noah and Julia and Chelsea and all these people that, like, you see as older in the room. You can set an example for us. Isn't that crazy? Because you don't often see that way. Like, you often see it like you are the ones that are, like, coming up and you have to reach, like, this certain spot. And at that point, man, you know, like, enough scripture. You understand enough that now you can really start to be vocal about it. Maybe now's when I can really start to do something. But he says, you can set the example for all believers. It's like he's saying, man, this is your time. And you don't even realize it. You think your time hasn't come yet. But it is your time. It is your time to do something. He says you can tell a different story. The story that has been told about you is you are too young and you are not enough and you are not worth it yet. That you don't matter yet. You're not respected yet. And he says you can tell a different story. The older generation, they had an opinion of the younger generation. Is that not still true today? Clearly, when Paul is saying this, clearly, like, the older generation, those of us that are in that category, had an opinion of what the younger generation was and what they weren't, what they were capable of and what they weren't, what they could say and what they couldn't, what the respect level should be and what it shouldn't be, what they can prophesy and they can speak over their generation with their mouth and what they can't. And he says this, I think this is probably the simplest way to do it, is he says you change their view by what you do. Like, the way you live is the way that you begin to change the view of those around you. It says this in 2 Timothy 2:15. It says, do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who does not need to be ashamed. Do you realize that? Like, you don't need to be ashamed. And I think, like, we live in a world that we feel shame all the time, right? Like, that is part of it. Like, we even have, like, memes for that, right? Like, you're fat shaming right now, or you're diet shaming, because if you do the opposite, then you got to get mad at the other one. Like, there's always, like, there's so much shame thrown around, right? Like, we have phrases for it, man. You're, like, throwing shade at me. Like, we constantly, like, have this idea of shame. It's something that we walk around with, right? Fair? Like, and I think this, like, kind of plays into the role of, like, why even as, like, a younger person, like, we think we're not capable of it, because every time something happens, someone throws some shame on us. And he says, don't be ashamed. And who correctly handles the word of truth? He says this is why you can't be ashamed. Because you've presented yourself to God in a certain way. You have lived your life in a certain way. You are a worker for God regardless of your age. And as a result, there is no shame on you. And so I think this is interesting, because I think like, I remember, like, this, like, when I was younger, like, I used to blame, like, the older generation, right? Like, and I think, like, and if I'm, like, totally honest, I think, like, even part of that, like, it still annoys me, like, even as a pastor, like, sometimes I'll get the, like, oh, that was a really good message for your age. Thanks, man. Thank you. Appreciate that. That's a great 29-year-old message, you know, which I got to throw out 29 because I got to enjoy that for just a couple more months. You guys know, right? Like, it's like the reality. You got to, like, enjoy 29 while you can. You don't know this feeling yet, but you will. It'll come, believe me. It's so fast, like, before you're even ready for it. But, like, you can feel that sometimes, right? Like, even if you do something well, it's, well, you did that well for your age. Which is, like, kind of like this indication that somehow if you were older, you could do it better. Somehow if you were older, God could use you in a different way because now you're 5 years older. How silly is that? But this is what we do. And I think like it's so easy for us to look at the older generation and to blame them and say, well, really, what you have done is you have oppressed me and you have pushed me down. And this is why I feel like I'm not good enough, because you have shamed me and you have cast me down. But Paul has this completely different idea of it. He says you don't blame the older generation, but you set an example for them. He completely flips it around. And so as I was thinking about this for you guys, and we're going to jump into worship here in a second, but I want you to think about this. I think we teach people how to treat us. I think even as a young person, we show them how they'll teach us. So what we have to do is we have to live differently. And I think you have this idea that we are a prophesying generation. And yet somehow we have prophesied against ourselves. I think you have this idea that we are called to do so much more as a generation. We are called to do way greater things than we do, but we've allowed ourselves to be pushed down. And so this is what I would encourage you guys as we get ready to kick off this series for the next couple of weeks. Don't allow yourself to be looked down upon because of your age. Because I think God has amazing things planned for you at your age. You just have to walk into it. You have to say, man, I will take that step. I was actually reading a book the other day. It's Francis Chan. Have you guys ever read Francis Chan? Watch him, listen to him. He's amazing. He's a fiery little Asian dude. But he tells the story of this girl that one of her like big ideas, like one of the things that she like desperately wanted to do was like buy Bibles. She wanted to buy Bibles to hand out, which is like, it's so weird. Like, I mean, I feel like even as like a pastor, I'd be like, man, you are like one of those like Christian kids, aren't you? Like you want to like spend all of your allowance money on Bibles. And so like that was her whole goal, was she wanted to buy all these Bibles. And so like she would mow lawns, she would do daycare, she would do all these different jobs, and she would buy Bibles, and she started to like stack them in her garage. And it talks about like she would go into her school and she would try to hand these out, and people would like reject her and be like, I don't really want that. That's like not really my thing. Like I'm a Democrat, whatever. But like you'll get that when you're older. But like they didn't want it, right? I said, no, like I don't want anything to do with that. And so she would try to hand them out. She'd try to start like a Bible study. And it says that like she was like the only one that came. Like it was just like this failure, right? It looked like a failure. And then there's one day that she's crossing the street and a car hits her. She dies, right? You didn't expect it to go there, but she dies. And Francis Chan is like the one that does like this funeral. And he says that like they begin, like all the school like comes out, right? Because like that's what happens. All of a sudden in those moments, everybody becomes united and they come together in those moments, right? He says he's doing this funeral and begins to share the gospel. Starts to ask if anybody wants to give their life to Christ. And all of a sudden student after student after student is coming. And this is what they had done. They had grabbed all those Bibles from her garage. They started handing them out. You never know when that time's going to come. But God can use you at a young age. Here she is in junior high, and how many lives did she end up affecting? So many, like dozens of lives were affected by her, because even at a young age, she said, man, I don't care what is spoken about me. I don't care what's prophesied about me, because I know what God has called me to. No matter what, your failure is not failure unless you don't obey God. Obedience is really success, right? Like you look at Noah, right? He's this old man that builds a boat for 127 years. You think people didn't think he was like a freak, right? Like, but when people walked by, and he's talking about rain, it has never rained before. And he's talking about rain that's going to flood the earth. He looked like a failure, right? But he was obedient to God. Jesus, if you think about even Jesus, this is a guy that had crowds after crowds after crowds follow him. And then suddenly they turned on him and said, if you're really the Messiah, you'll save yourself. And they threw him up on a cross. When they watched for a few hours as he slowly died, surely that must have looked like failure, right? But obedience is really where the success comes from. Don't ever let anybody say you are not capable of those things because you are young. You can do amazing things. You can do great things. There can be stories that are written about you. There can be message illustrations that you are used in one day because you say, man, I'm going to follow God, and it doesn't matter what my age is. In fact, I should start while I'm young. I should start doing something amazing for God now. So this is what we're going to do. We're getting ready to worship. And when you worship today, man, I want like some of those old things to just like be cast off, right? Man, if you've had things said about you, that you're not good enough, that you can't do this, that you can't do that, man, let this be a moment that that's just wiped away, that you can just encounter a God that so desperately loves you and cares about you. Man, if you come here and you feel like, man, I don't have any sort of destiny for my life, like that's not me, Wes. I don't have a purpose. I don't have that story. Man, I pray like as you begin to worship God tonight that he puts something in your heart. That he puts a vision in there. That he puts a prophecy in your heart of something great that you can have a passion for him that you're going to do. So as we go ahead and come up here, let's worship him the way he deserves to, because he is a God that loves us. He is a God that cares about us. And he is a God that has great things for us.